So hi everybody, buonasera, siamo finalmente nel sole. There's a little bit of sunshine after a few days of misty, foggy Venice. I'm Francesca Tarocco, and I'm the director of NICHE, Center for Environmental Humanities. Actually, we are just about to change our name. So here you still see the logo with our affiliation with the new institute in Hamburg, but now we are fully of Ca' Foscari, so we are now NICHE, Center for Environmental Humanities at Ca' Foscari University of Venice. We've been around for a few years now, and we are delighted to have Sasha Gora, Professor Sasha Gora, in our series of new books in environmental humanities, which is a series that we have been launching since the beginning of when NICHE was founded. And Sasha Gora is, in fact, partly also of Venice. So we are even more happy to see her back. She's now in Augsburg with her own research project that probably she will say a few words about. But she's a former fellow of an institute here in Venice. So it's great to have her back, and in fact, we are very happy for her to be in dialogue with Fulvia Larena, who is based in Venice and partly based in Venice. Sorry, she will also tell you about that. So new books in environmental humanities, I think this is a very interesting book because it's a very ambitious book. It's also a long time in the making. Sasha is an environmental historian and someone who really uses food as a lens to think about, historically, but also engage the present of our global food culture. And so her perspective is really important and rather unique in the context of the environmental humanities. So thank you very much for being here, and I leave the floor to you.
Hello. Thank you, everyone, so much for coming here. As Francesca mentioned, the sun came out just in time for my presentation, so I very much appreciate you choosing to be inside right now. And it's a real honor to be able to share this book project here in Venice. So thank you, Francesca, for the invitation, for the introduction. Thank you to NICHE as well, especially to Anna and Julia. And thank you to Fulvia. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. And in many ways, it feels like a kind of homecoming. So as Francesca mentioned, this book was years in the making. I won't tell you how many years because it will make me feel very old. But the first version of it started when I was here as a postdoc. So it evolved from my doctoral research, which I did at the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society at the University of Munich. And then I moved to Venice for a postdoc. And it was around this time of year that I submitted the manuscript, the first version of the book. So really to go from this doctoral project and the rehearsal, thinking about it as kind of an assignment so that I could call myself a doctor, to thinking about what does this mean as a book? How does the project evolve in this way? And so I remember every day working on it in the morning, the smell of the lagoon, also the smell of the fritto misto at the place below my apartment. And so I feel like this book is very much seasoned by my experience in Venice, and then what it was like writing in my mother tongue, which is English, at the same time that twice a week I was taking Italian lessons. And so really reflecting on language and heritage and culture. So with my talk today, I'm endlessly fascinated by form and format. And more precisely, I'm interested in how we talk about books, and especially academic books, what kind of presentation mode we go into when we share books. So books famously are things that we write and read, and then if you go to a book reading, the author often reads from the book, but when we go to academic book writing or book presentations, it's a little bit different because we've talked about this book so many times already, and we go from conceptualizing it as a project, a work in progress, a book in the making, working title, to all of a sudden it's a book, and it kind of feels like we use the same presentation mode. So with that in mind, I want to kind of merge these two modes with my talk today. So I'll start with a reading, and then I'll move into a book talk. And so with this, I will give a more general tour of the terrain that Culinary Claims, Indigenous Restaurant Politics in Canada covers. So this book was published by the University of Toronto Press last year as part of its Culinaria series. The meal began with mijones con fresas y pipa, a soup of mussels and green strawberries strained to be as fluid as water and crowned with coconut foam. Local ingredients, tropical ingredients. I was embarking on a 12-course tasting menu at Intimo in Panama City, the capital of a slender country that couples two continents, although one local told me she grew up believing they are one. Having been born and raised in the lands now called Canada, in Panama, I felt as if I was on the continent's furthest edge. I was somewhere I considered south, and yet this soup with coconut made me think of the north. What is north and what is south depends on both geography and culture. But while dining at Intimo, I was surprised to be confronted by the north. It was not the aggressive air conditioning. Rather, it was the restaurant's cookbook collection, fanned behind the bar like decor. My stool granted a view of the open kitchen, of its shelves of books and booze. Fäviken by Magnus Nilsson, which is named after the restaurant he ran in northern Sweden for over a decade. Copenhagen-based René Redzepi's famed Noma, Time and Place in Nordic Cuisine, and another tome from the Danish capital, Relay, a book of ideas by Christian F. Puglisi. Why look north? What can a chef working with tropical ingredients glean from a Nordic cookbook? I may give the impression that I can give a tidy definition of what or where the north is, but my concern here is something else. It is about how place is imagined through food. And unlike the so-called empty landscapes that Lauren Harris and other settler Canadian artists, including the Group of Seven, famously painted, razor-sharp glaciers and windswept trees, my understanding of place is one inhabited by people. So, to revise my question, how are place and the peoples of a particular place imagined through food? Culinary Claims, Indigenous Restaurant Politics in Canada, looks north to chronicle a cultural shift in representations of Indigenous foodways, the changing relationship between cuisine and place, and the textures of this, so to say the tastes of this, in a settler colonial state. More specifically, it stories the emergence of Indigenous cuisines in urban restaurants across Canada. Plants and animals, as we know, trespass borders. Cuisines do too. And so to study culinary changes, to consider how the local is knotted with the global, I cross the Atlantic to weigh what is Nordic fare and its international influence. That said, the Nordic is less of a subject and more of a context, a distant backdrop. The book also travels to Canada's southern neighbor, the United States, to better chart the role that restaurants play in Indigenous resurgence beyond colonial lines. It went south to understand the north, venturing to California, and via the mussel and green strawberry soup to Panama. The lands it depicts are urban, have ripe appetites, and are hungry for stories that better represent their histories, peoples, and foods. So as I mentioned, that is the preface of the book, and I wanted to start with it because I imagine you did not expect that geography to start in Panama City. And I'm also using today as an opportunity to share a couple of images that I was not able to secure permission to use in the book, which I'm happy to talk about later because I think this is really interesting too. And so this is a map that CBC, which is the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation of Canada, so Canada's version of the BBC, published as part of an article in 2017. And yes, the CBC did not give me permission to include this in the book, so you get to see it now. And so the article begins with, wander down Restaurant Row in any of Canada's major cities, and you'll see a culinary mosaic of international offerings. But there's a culture that's been notably absent until now. So with this text that opens the article, it emphasizes the last two words, until now. And then it describes, quote, a new surge of Indigenous restaurants, quote, which many note is long overdue. The Mukamuk, Vancouver, opened in 1971. Bungees, Winnipeg, opened in 1981. Tribes, Edmonton, opened in 1982. The Quillicum, Vancouver, opened in 1985. The Lilligant Feast House, Vancouver, opened in 1995. Connie's Corner Cafe, Winnipeg, opened in 1997. I could keep going, but I think you get the point here that none of these restaurants that I'm naming appear on this map. So some of them closed not long after opening, and others lasted decades. But either way, what I'm trying to get at here is that Indigenous restaurants are not necessarily new, although the media, the public, and even some chefs perceive them as such. And so this is one of the things that I'm interested in. So the cultural legacies, or why are these earlier restaurants not remembered, and what work did they actually do? So as a bit of a crash intro to Canadian history, as I mentioned, the CBC published this map in 2017. So this was 2 years after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada concluded that the Indian residential school system had committed cultural genocide. If you look at the definition of genocide, there is no cultural genocide, it's just genocide. So this was 21 years after the last residential school closed. Are people familiar with what a residential school is? Great. So essentially in the United States, they were called Indian boarding schools, and in Canada, they were residential schools. So this map was published 132 years after the last spike was driven into the Canadian Pacific Railway, which I will talk about in a bit. This was published 141 years after the so-called Indian Act and 150 years after Canadian Confederation. To study food, I argue, is to study how it is rooted in or transcends place. It is to study land and water, and how land and water are worked and transformed, imagined and represented, bought, sold, won and lost, whom they belong to, and who belong to them. So in Canada, to talk about food is to talk about land. It is to talk about power, colonial erasure, and now, increasingly, Indigenous resurgence. Food enacts relationships, and this is a point that the Anishinaabe activist Winona LaDuke makes. She writes that, quote, food is land. And she continues, quote, food for us comes from our relatives, whether they have wings or fins or roots. Food has a culture, it has a history, it has a story, it has relationships, end quote. So we can think about culinary encounters as intimate and how they dissolve boundaries between food and feed and between bodies and environments. So to study food is to also study relations, and it is to study power. The literary scholar Marjorie Fee, she asked the question, how does literature claim land? And this is in a book that she published called Literary Land Claims. And so my book very much pays homage to her work. So I in turn ask, how does food claim land? I am a fourth-generation settler from Toronto, which is a word that comes from the Mohawk Takaranto and is the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I think this is really important for any research project to reflect on positionality. The Cree Métis scholar, Deanna Rader, emphasizes that all knowledge is generated from particular positions and that there is no unbiased neutral position possible. So by locating myself in relation to my research, I recognize the place-based responsibilities that I have inherited as a guest on the lands where I was born and raised. And this is to say, with my book, Culinary Claims, it does not study what people in Canada eat per se. Instead, it very much focuses on restaurant culture. Sometimes this overlaps, sometimes, as we'll see with one menu, it doesn't. And so I study menus as cultural texts to reflect on how restaurants stage narratives and how menus hold things in relation with other things. And by things, I mean flora and fauna. So Culinary Claims details how restaurants interact with larger political and social forces, and this is what I mean by restaurant politics. So thinking about their role as venues for cultural representation. Any plate that serves plants or animals, by default, I argue, also serves land. Michael Twitty, who is a culinary historian and writer, he recently published an excellent book about rice. He writes that, quote, "There is no chef without a homeland. Your plate is your flag." So we can think about food as a testimony to a chef and to a culture's relationship to and with land. And so because of this, culturally land can be claimed and then reclaimed through food. So to track the evolution of the representation of Indigenous foodways in Canada, I focus on roughly 1967 to 2017, so this gives me a very neat 50 years to focus on. But I also jump back to the late 19th century and first half of the 20th. The book concentrates on urban Canada, so some of the cities that you see on this map. And as I've already established, Indigenous restaurants have come and gone since the 1970s, and yet there is little cultural memory of them. So I'm seeking to reclaim this work. So looking at my hometown of Toronto, there are over 8,000 restaurants in Toronto. Toronto is now the fourth largest city in North America. And until 2016, so 1 year before this map, only one restaurant served Indigenous fare, and that was Tea and Bannock, which is listed. Then the Powwow Cafe opened, which is not included in this map, and two more in 2017, Niche Dish and Cookham Kitchen. Unfortunately, most of them have closed again because of the pandemic, but that's a different story. So I'm interested in knowing why there are so few Indigenous eateries in Toronto, as well as the rest of the country, and how this particular Toronto tale relates to changes in global restaurant culture. But I think it's also important to address a question that I have been asked many, many, many times in my academic career as an environmental historian, which is why study restaurants? Or why do archives have menus? What could we possibly learn from menus? And I find this fascinating because restaurants are so naturalized that we think about them as ahistorical, as if they have always been there. And so it's important to say that in the history of eating out, the restaurant is just one model. So there's a lot of other models. We can think about taverns and inns, guest houses and cafes, tea houses and cookshops. So there's examples of what we would call street food today from Pompeii. Imperial China also has examples. But the word restaurant and then the space we now associate with it emerged in 18th century Paris. If you're interested in this history, Rebecca Spang has written a fabulous book called The Invention of the Restaurant that just had its 20th anniversary 2 years ago. There's also a lot of myths around this early beginning and this idea that because of the French Revolution, there were all these chefs that were out of work, and so they had to create places for them to work. But she actually shows that these places that are called restaurants emerged several decades before the French Revolution. So they first referred to a restaurateur's room, and this was a place where people went to sip restorative bouillons. So what is really fascinating is before a restaurant became a place to eat, it was something that you would eat. So you could go to one of these places and order un restaurant, which, as I said, was a restorative soup. So by the 1820s, restaurateur rooms had evolved into what we recognize as restaurants today. And there's a lot of differences between the restaurant and earlier examples, and that has to do with the menu. Do you have options? Do you have individual tables? Is it one dish for everybody? Can you eat at different times? And then really thinking about this idea of having individual meal experiences in a somewhat public place. So over time, restaurants have served diverse people with distinct needs. So hungry travelers, for example, elite socialites, workers in need of lunch, bachelors without kitchens, families on the road. And they're interesting because they're somewhere between public and private. So they're places to eat as well as places to be seen eating. So this also makes them venues for distinction, for social performance. And some restaurants maintain the status quo, having upheld, for example, racial, gender, and socioeconomic segregation, policing who can dine where and with whom, and others have challenged such divisions, pushing to expand who can claim a seat at the table. So an example of this is the civil rights movement in the United States, where there are a lot of sit-ins at restaurants, so really thinking about countering segregation. So in English, there are separate words for menu and map, but in French, they share one, la carte. So like a map, and this is why I still have the map up here, a menu drafts lines with which to imagine the space of the nation. We can think about how restaurants also map borders, they chart cuisines, and they draw lines between what is on and off the table. So why have there been so few Indigenous restaurants in Canada? Chapter 1 responds to this question by unpacking colonial cultural narratives and surveying what drove Indigenous foods off the menu. So this is an image that I found at the National Archives in Ottawa that I did receive permission to include in the book. And as you can see, it's two Indigenous women who are unnamed, unfortunately, in terms of the documentation, looking at Canada's food guide. So what you see at the top is milk. I don't need to get into that. As we know, milk is a very cultural food. There's a lot of scholarship around that, also thinking about what is sometimes called milk colonialism, which bodies digest milk, which bodies do not, which cultures have traditions of consuming milk, but as you can see, this is a Euro-Canadian idea of food. So as the word gives away, agriculture is cultural. It is the process of selecting plants and animals that transforms them into food. So something being edible or perhaps even delicious is not enough to taxonomize it as food. Frida Knobloch, who is an American studies scholar, argues that, quote, colonization is an agricultural act. And she writes how the word colony comes from the Latin colonus, which means farmer. So in Canada, colonization through food worked in two ways. The first was to remove existing Indigenous food sources, such as agricultural and hunting lands, or animals, like the bison. And the second is what you see in this image, which was to replace them with European systems that, in addition to producing edible commodities like wheat and cows, also produced new symbolic values. And a lot of this also had to do with property and ownership. So this is an artwork that is already 20 years old, but it's one that I really love by Sunny Asu. And Sunny Asu grew up in the suburbs of what is now called Vancouver. And it was actually only when he was around 8 years old that he learned that he was Indigenous and that his family are members of the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation. So when he went to art school, he was really interested in the tension of growing up as an Indigenous person in a settler-dominated city, but you can also see in terms of the aesthetics, also with pop culture and humor. So this series is called Breakfast Series, and I love this work because at first it looks very familiar, especially for anyone who was allowed to eat sugary cereal as a child, or perhaps has seen advertisements or has gone to a North American grocery store and has been overwhelmed by all the sugary cereal options for breakfast. So there's something that's very familiar, but then he changed the names. So instead of Frosted Flakes in the middle, we see Treaty Flakes. And so what this work represents is also the introduction of what is called commodity foods. So as I mentioned in terms of the colonial project, removing Indigenous nations' ability to procure their own food, and at the same time introducing other foods that were often cheap or provided for with food stamps. And so this really shows a different relationship to food. So Sunny Asu, wonderful artist, wonderful person, gave me permission to include the images of his artworks. These are a couple images that I could not include once again, so you get a preview of them. And so, despite attempts to erase Indigenous foodways, as I mentioned, these initiatives to take Indigenous foodways pretty much off the menu, there's also a history in Canada of appropriating them. So the use of Indigenous imagery to sell Canada begins with a railroad, 2 oceans, and the dream to transform the land in between into one nation. In 1871, British Columbia became Canada's 6th province. So this was 4 years after Confederation, and the Dominion of Canada courted BC by promising to build a railway all the way to the Pacific. So thinking back on the map, that was a pretty big accomplishment for an area where there were not a lot of people living at the time. But in order to build this railroad, the government hurried efforts to abolish Indigenous title to land. So between 1871 and 1877, signed number treaties 1 through 7 were established. And this is part of what the Cree scholar Tabitha Martins, who's a professor at the University of British Columbia, calls the Hunger Project. So really trying to clear Indigenous people off of these lands so they could build the railroad. So construction commenced in 1881, and the railway's last spike, which I mentioned earlier, was driven in 1885. So by then, the vast majority of Indigenous people were on reserves. So in Canada, they're called reserves, in the US, reservations, more or less. The Canadian Pacific Railway did not connect a nation, it created one. But the role of Indigenous peoples in this nation was up for debate. So on the one hand, they were sectioned off on reserves, a classic out of sight, out of mind scenario. And on the other hand, they were appearing in paintings as Canada mined for material with which to build its own identity. I should also mention that the system of reserves in Canada was the blueprint for the apartheid system in South Africa. So accompanying the tracks, the CPR, the Canadian Pacific Railway, also built a series of hotels designed to mimic European chateaus, including the very iconic Banff Springs Hotel, which was built in 1888. So a good room on a train or in a hotel should come with the option of board. And the CPR provided many dining options, so from train station lunch counters and onboard restaurant wagons to hotel dining rooms. So the menus sold visual stories about the land that it conquered, crossed, and connected. So this is one example of a menu before the Canadian Pacific, which I found at the Thomas Fisher Rare Books Library at the University of Toronto. It is not dated based on the folder I found it in. I'm guessing it's from around the 1930s, 1940s. This is the cover of it, and this is the back. So referring to the 1880s, The back states, quote, "Before the Canadian Pacific, this is how the plains looked. Wild." Building the railroad across this, quote, "unsettled, unproductive continent" was the supreme test of the growing nation's courage, its vision, and its resources. So as you can hear, this is a hyperbolic flag-waving text. It exclaims, "Think of Canada without Vancouver. Without transportation, Canada's boundless acres had no value." So it wraps up with, "The Canadian Pacific laid the foundation of Canada's greatness." Great being a word that does not taste so good right now. So you have this text on the back, but at no point does it ever actually address the cover. Instead, the image here is utilized to represent a before that was, quote, "unsettled and unproductive." And then the CPR, the Canadian Pacific Railway, takes credit for the after. So I also want to mention that in this region, what is called the prairies, cattle are huge and also wheat is huge. So Italy, to keep up with global demand for dried pasta in particular, imports around 40% of its durum wheat for pasta production, and Canada is actually its main supplier. And this is high-protein Manitoba flour. So thinking about the clearing of the prairies, the introduction of wheat, there is a direct connection between this history and the pasta that many of us eat today. So looking at the foods that are on offer, the dishes, I'm not sure if you can read them, but they're pretty standard. There's omelets, there's chicken, there's roast beef. So some descriptions signify geographical provenance, such as Okanagan celery and Lake Superior trout. But for the most part, I argue that there's a disconnect between the image on the cover and the actual foods that the menu is serving. So this menu exemplifies a tendency that Patrick Wolfe has identified. Patrick Wolfe is really credited with settler colonialism studies and thinking about colonization as, quote, "not an event, but a structure," which I think is really important. And how he identifies how, on the one hand, settler society required the practical elimination of the natives in order to establish itself on their territory. But on the symbolic level, settler society subsequently sought to recuperate indigeneity in order to express its difference from the mother country. So what's also important is how the menu's representation of Indigenous peoples restricted them to the past as opposed to the present. But this changed in 1967, which is when Canada celebrated its centennial. And here, Indigenous foods were back on the menu, but this time as Canadian, which I talk about in chapter 2. And the book also has these images, but they're so fantastic that I want to share them as well. So Canada celebrated its centennial by hosting the International and Universal Exposition in Montreal, which is often called Expo 67. And it had an official Canadian restaurant, which was La Toundre, which was an edible declaration of the country's identity. So the expo ran from April to October of 1967, and it attracted more than 50 million visitors. When I was revisiting this number, I had to triple check because the population of Canada today is around 40 million. And about 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, it was around 30 million. So thinking about 1967, I don't know, I'm guessing these were not single visitors, but this is to say it was wildly popular Expo 67. Not everyone was eating at this restaurant, but for example, my grandfather, who was born in Toronto, this was the first time that he ever went to Montreal. It was really an opportunity for people from the US, but also Canadians traveling within Canada. So Expo 67 was concerned with proving that Canada had matured into a cohesive and, quote, civilized nation. So really the country that the railway menu that we saw earlier was rallying for. So La Tundra was one of 2 restaurants representing the host nation, and the menu was divided into 3 sections. So cuisine canadienne, La Tundra, and international cuisine. So this is the one showing cuisine canadienne. So the menu is bilingual, and you have French on the left, and then you have English on the right. It is interesting, though, because this actually predates Canada's 1969 Official Languages Act. So at this point, English was still the official language. It was not yet officially bilingual. And so the first pages announce cuisine canadienne and then La Tundra, and these subtitles appear only in French. English, interestingly, represents international cuisine. And so part of this might be to reflect Montreal's majority language, but it could also be seen as aligning and therefore elevating Canadian fare with the cuisine of France, which, as we know, has long had a better reputation than the cuisine of Britain. So each of the 3 menu parts have a similar structure, but the names differ. And the names that are on cuisine canadienne and La Tundra really read like prose. So things like nibbles and morsels, steaming crocs, hearty fares, and dainty and piquant. So that's cuisine canadienne. And then for La Tundra, we have from icy streams and lakes, bubbling kettles, and sustaining and fortifying. And then international cuisine is pretty boring in comparison. So we have savory appetizers, entrees, and desserts. And the less common dishes, including beaver tail broth, so made with the tail of a beaver, are listed under La Tundra. And so what's interesting here is this menu represents foods that pretty much no settler Canadians would have eaten at that time. And it matter-of-factly includes foods that today are often illegal to serve. So one is the beluga casserole. So it's described as the hearty flavor of beluga whale meat prepared in the fashion of today. But whale meat has never been, for the settler population, a popular meat. So in a nutshell, Expo 67 branded Canada a modern northern country, simultaneously civilized and full of wilderness. It imagined a plentiful assortment of Indigenous ingredients that now belong to the national pantry. So we would consider this kind of a pop-up restaurant today. And in comparison, Chapter 3 takes up eateries at large and fleshes out the 3 time periods of Indigenous restaurants I define. So 1971 to 1996, 97 to 2014, and 2015 to the present. So starting with Chapter 4, the chapters follow spotlight-specific restaurants, and Chapters 4 and 5 map Vancouver's first Indigenous eateries. And I just want to spotlight the first one, and this is a menu that is from the Mukhamuk restaurant from circa 1975. Fulvia and I were talking about this restaurant the other day, and it's a pretty spicy history, and I imagine at one point there will be some kind of documentary about it. But essentially, very quickly, in 1971, which is the same year that Alice Waters opened Chez Panisse in Berkeley, the Mukhamuk opened in Vancouver. And essentially, it was opened by 3 Canadian settlers. One of them is named Douglas Christmas. He had an art gallery called the Ace Gallery. He later moved the gallery to Los Angeles. He's been sued a bunch of times. Last year, he was sent to jail because of shady business. And so he's behind the first Indigenous-themed restaurant in Vancouver. It was extremely popular. Andy Warhol ate there because Doug Christmas represented him as a gallerist. The New York Times recommended it in an article in 1977, which, was a big deal in Canada. But essentially, 1 year after it opened, it had to close temporarily because of labor problems. It did reopen, but the problems did not end. And employees, so even though all 3 owners were settler Canadians, almost all employees in the restaurant were Indigenous. They had joined a grassroots socialist feminist union, which launched a strike that lasted 3 years. So as one of the employees explained, racial issues emerged when employees realized that the owners were getting rich off native culture. So this is an example of culinary and cultural appropriation. The Muk, because of the 3-year strike and then other issues, closed in 1981, and then some of its employees reopened the space as the Quillicum in 1985. So the Quillicum is a Chinook jargon word meaning return of the people. So this doubled as a metaphor. So thinking about how to return is to resurge, and the name takes back the restaurant and reclaims it for its Indigenous staff and now co-owners. So here is a picture of the strike that was in front of the restaurant. And as I said, it lasted 3 years, so it is one of the largest labor strikes in Canadian history. Or longest, yeah. But essentially, then Doug Christmas was based permanently in California. He no longer had a Canadian address, so he didn't have to pay the amount that he was charged. But hey, he was charged last year. So chapter 6 discusses early Indigenous restaurants in the Rockies and on the prairies, and then chapter 7 turns to Toronto to review its past and present eateries. And here I chart how some claim dishes and others reclaim ingredients. So earlier restaurants rallied for cultural recognition, and more recent ones are rallying for Indigenous political resurgence. And so this restaurant, Niche Dish, unfortunately closed during the pandemic, but I think this is really cute. So Niche Dish's motto was "Your friendly neighbor since always." And in the front of the restaurant, they had this parking sign, so thinking about the play on reservation, the double meaning of it. So similar to Sunny Asu's work, there's a great sense of humor there. So all of the chapters couple restaurants with clusters of ideas about Canada's culinary landscape. And the last 3 focus on specific examples of animals. So I talk about beaver as an example of conflicting imaginations of the edible. I talk about seal in relation to Indigenous food sovereignty, and I talk about salmon in relation to the F word, which in this instance is farmed, and thinking about aquaculture and commodification. So with these ideas about Canada's culinary landscape, the book is also asking questions about who is able to partake, in what role, and on what terms. And together they add up to an argument about how old ingredients tell new stories about the relationship between food and land, people and politics, eating and the environment. So eating is a form of building community, of sharing and exchange. Food builds relationships with what you eat and whom you eat it with, and it therefore plays a central role in efforts made by Indigenous communities across the country, continent, and world to reclaim languages, traditions, and culture, as well as land. So in many instances, Indigenous chefs may serve similar dishes as farm-to-table Canadian ones, but they serve different stories. And so to conclude, I want to share the artwork that I have a detail of on the cover of my book that I'm so honored to be able to share. So in 2019, Toronto hosted its inaugural biennial, and for it, the artists Adrian Stimson and A.A. Bronson, for those of you who are familiar with the legendary collective General Idea, A.A. Bronson was a member, the two of them collaborated on an installation. So Adrian Stimson is a member of the Siksika Nation, and he is the great-grandson of Chief Old Son. Bronson is the great-grandson of Reverend John Williams Timms. And so Timms was an Anglican missionary and founder of the Old Son Residential School. So essentially, these 2 artists were looking at the histories of their families and their great-grandfathers and how they were on opposing sides of the 1895 Siksika Rebellion. And the rebellion was due in part because shortages of food. So this comes back to the Canadian Pacific Railway and the Hunger Project. So for the biennial, Bronson revisited his family's history to craft a piece that he called A Public Apology to Siksika Nation. So this included a book and a performance. And then at the center of this work is Stimson's Ini Sonkampai, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? So an artwork that memorializes the experience of residential school survivors. So Stimson dresses the table in white cloth and gold-rimmed plates, and a bronze bison sculpture perches on each plate, which is a reminder of how the decimation of the bison forced the Siksika onto reserves. So here, and you are welcome, the table is set for a conversation between Bronson and the Siksika, a stage for an apology. So this is an example of the kind of conversations that tables host. So I just want to end because I've been thinking a lot in terms of the rupture that the world is currently experiencing, also what's going on in Minneapolis and St. Paul. I won't get into it, but there's an amazing chef there, Sean Sherman, who goes by the name the Sioux Chef, who grew up on Pine Ridge Reservation. He's a member of the Oglala Lakota Nation, and his restaurant has been very active in terms of providing community support. He only serves pre-contact ingredients, but also just thinking about the role that restaurants play, but also how they relate to larger histories of state violence in Turtle Island, so both Canada and the United States. So just as a reminder, thinking about Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, his speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos just recently, he said, if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. And I think this is a great example in terms of power, food, and different ways of approaching relationships to environment and people. So thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Well, thank you, Sasha, for this wonderful introduction. And I'm really honored to be in conversation with you about this wonderful new book. And thanks to Francesca Tarocco and NICHE for inviting me. I truly enjoyed reading Culinary Claims, which I found to be an unusually intelligent book because it does not treat food as a metaphor, but as an analytic device. By taking restaurant menus and ingredients seriously, you use food to read the dense entanglements of land, history, power, and identity in Canada. What emerges is not simply a history of eating out, but a way of understanding how colonialism, nationalism, and indigenous resurgence are negotiated through everyday practices of production and consumption. Behind the book's careful analysis and its ability to stay with the complexities of each issue, one of the aspects that makes Culinary Claims particularly compelling is the positionality that you articulate from the very beginning. Your attention to your own role as a researcher and your concern with avoiding extractivism, even when telling stories, is striking. We often discuss how research can extract narratives and knowledges, turning them into academic capital for our own aims. In the introduction to Culinary Claims, as we heard, in fact, you speak about telling stories not for Indigenous people, but alongside them. So, in your research, how did you navigate this tension? What concrete strategies helped you write without appropriating and to build relationships that were not merely based on sources, but on reciprocity and responsibility?
Yeah, thank you for flagging this, because I think, as you mentioned, it's really important for research in general, and I don't fully understand how it got to a point where academics are supposed to not have bodies or experiences. And even though a lot of disciplines have been moving away from that and thinking about the role of auto theory, for instance, or more self-reflective methods, especially in ethnography, there's still this idea that we need to create distance. But I think that actually it's in the intimacy where people share stories, not in being distant. And so I was lucky because I had a couple of experiences where people really shared this with me. So I mentioned the restaurant Niche Dish in Toronto, and it is owned by Joel White Duck Ringette. He's an Anishinaabe chef. He had a catering business for a long time. He continues to do that since he closed his restaurant. And when I contacted him, he's like, sure, I'd love to talk to you, but what do I get? Let's make this an exchange. And I was like, absolutely. And so with all the chefs that I spoke to who were generous with their stories, I also asked them what I could do, what I could contribute. So actually some of these menus that I showed you, especially because serving wild game in Canada is illegal in most of the country. So it was so fascinating to see that then the government was doing this and contemporary Indigenous chefs weren't. You know, I asked them, can I look for things in the archive? Are there things you're interested in, you know? And so really just creating a dialogue. So I think that is really important. So similar to that experience with Joel White Duck Ringette, I met Audrey Logan, who is a permaculturalist. She's based in Winnipeg. And that was the same thing that she asked me too, you know, really thinking about what are you doing with these stories? And I think this is really important, especially in terms of academic work and thinking about ownership and cultural ownership, is that we can't tell everyone else's stories. Stories don't belong to all of us. And, you know, accessibility is very important, but, you know, there's a lot of sticky issues too in terms of what happens with that story. And so, you know, on the one hand, I'm sure there's some historians and even just doing contemporary history with a mix of using archival methods, going to archives, but also doing oral histories and ethnography would probably disagree with me in terms of, you know, making this as an exchange. But I think ethically, it's the only way where it's a collaboration. It's recognizing different stories and access to knowledge.
Speak about relationship, and maybe everything is about relationship.
Yes.
One of the key ideas in culinary claims is that restaurants and menu are never neutral. They are narrative devices that shape what counts as local and authentic or traditional. Because food is such a powerful medium, these narratives can easily be softened or adulterated to fit the consumer expectation, appearing critical while leaving power relationship untouched. This is where your discussion of authenticity really struck me. You show how authentic food can become a cage. It freezes cuisines, ties them to fixed identities, and produces what you call repressive authenticity. Only certain and reassuring versions of indigeneity become acceptable and edible. At the same time, you warn against the myth of origins, where indigenous food is seen as real only if stay pre-colonial and unchanged. Reading this from Italy, I see strong parallels. Many foods that we call traditional are also the result of colonial histories, yet authenticity is still used to freeze rural cultures into comforting images for bourgeois intellectual. So how can restaurants tell stories about land, history, crisis without domesticating them into feel-good narratives? And how did Chef you met negotiate this tension between hospitality and sovereignty without getting trapped in either representative authenticity or nostalgic myth of the past?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I think it is very relevant today. And so when I teach food studies, the first thing that I often underscore is getting rid of authenticity as a ruler. It's something that comes up in a lot of restaurant criticism, but you know, if we can kind of think about a MacBook, right? And this is like the authentic original MacBook, and then, you know, you compare your Nona's recipe for something to somebody else's Nona's recipe. It's not about, you know, an original that's being replicated. It's this question of, does it make sense with food? And it doesn't. And so with repressive authenticity, it's also this question of what is called fusion food and who is allowed to fuse whom's food. So thinking about how, you know, quite often especially in the context of North America, it would be a white chef who is super creative for, mixing like French and Japanese food, or thinking about the legacy of Wolfgang Puck in Los Angeles, right? And he's allowed to be creative. And then if you go to a Thai restaurant, and God forbid there's something that is not like the one curry you had once as a tourist in Thailand, then you're like, this is not real Thai food, this is changed food. And so then if a Thai chef wants to be creative and fuse somebody else's food, then they're being criticized of not being authentic. And I think this is a really big issue for Indigenous restaurants, but also chefs who have the burden of representing a culture as opposed to just being a chef who can represent their own taste and their own, culinary perspective. And so this is what has been really interesting with the research as well, because at no point do I define Indigenous restaurants. The ones that I study all define themselves as Indigenous restaurants, and with the different ones that I chronicle in the book, and so it's about 15 that I focus on, they're all wildly different. So some, for example, like Sean Sherman, who I mentioned, who has the restaurant in Minneapolis called Owamni, he just serves pre-contact ingredients, and there are some chefs who do this as well. But others, they serve what is called bannock or fry bread, which is made from wheat flour, and then they have what's called so-called Indian tacos. So it would be the fried bread, and then you would have shredded beef on it, and then you would maybe have cheese. And so this is considered to be powwow fare. But I think what is really important is just understanding what is this work that is behind the scenes, behind labels like authentic doing. And so that's why, I'm really interested in just seeing this range and not wanting to conclude that this is an Indigenous restaurant and this is not, but just showing what this means to different chefs.
And I think this is a very important issue now that we are in the UNESCO list for immaterial culture, for our cultural food, and how much authenticity could, yeah, totally. No?
Yeah, it's a reminder that it can be a weapon, right? So really thinking about making room for certain stories and certain people and not for others.
Also, yes, of course. Thank you. Throughout the book, a recurring divide appears between Indigenous conception of land as relationship and settler conception of land as property or capital. This struck me because in a different context, it recalls an Italian transition, the transformation of land from a space of care and subsistence into an industrial productive unit, where cultivation is no longer about taking care, but about executive labor for profit. Do you think could be an analogy in this field? And what do we risk losing culturally and ecologically when land is reduced to a technical support for yield and market value? And still on land, a key node in the book is that access to land determines access to food, and that colonization often aims not at coexistence, but at replacing one word with another, a process of replace and replace. You also discussed the distinction between commercial agriculture and subsistence gardens, such as the story of Three Sisters, showing that agriculture is not natural, but a cultural practice based on selection and exclusion. If you had to summarize it for us, how does colonization rewrite what is edible and transform into food, and in doing so, rewrite time and history, so what you call settler time, which I think is a neuralgic point of the book.
Yeah, so settler time is a concept that Mark Rifkin has written about, and he's a professor now at the University of Buffalo. And I think we were talking about time yesterday and the day before, and temporalities, and thinking about that in terms of ecosystems, different species. And I think that, with the so-called Anthropocene, a lot of the work is about time. So thinking about geological time, but also different scales. So I have one colleague, Maya Hay, who focuses on microbes. So even thinking about microbial time or just understanding more than human time scales and temporalities. And so with settler time, so with Mark Rifkin's concept, he really talks about this was part of the colonial project, and he's focusing mostly on the US, but I think what's really important, and that's why I wanted to mention Minnesota and Minneapolis, is a lot of Indigenous peoples will say, we didn't cross the border crossed us. This is not our border, this is somebody else's border. And so in terms of settler time, I saw this meme when Canada was celebrating its 150th birthday, and there was a billboard with a woman standing in front of it, and it said Canada 150, and then it said Mi'kmaq, which is a nation in Eastern Canada, 10,000. You know, and so the idea with settler time is exactly kind of rewriting when does history begin on certain lands. But the issue that Mark Rifkin also pinpoints, and this kind of comes back to the menu, is that it's not just about kind of restarting the clock, but then all of a sudden, Indigenous nations who had different experiences and understandings of time are then having to be fit into the settler colonial present, right? And so I think that's really important, and this kind of goes in the direction of the work that I do with my research group Off the Menu, and some of the thinking I really started here in Venice with the relationship between eating and ecology. But one of the questions that I always ask is, where does a recipe begin? Does a recipe begin in the kitchen? Does it begin in the market? Does it begin in the soil? Yeah, in the garden, in the soil. Does it begin, you know, if you have salt that's 10,000 years old, or you have an oyster that's 4 years old? And what happens if we expand that to understand what is actually included in a recipe? And so with the three sisters, I just wanted to mention for those of you not familiar with the concept, so with thinking about what is called now permaculture, but it's essentially companion planting. So you have the squash, and you have the corn, and you have the beans. So thinking about planting them together and then how they kind of work in tandem. And so one of the things that's really tricky, and it's really the binary I try to avoid in the book, is that this contrast between kind of the romanticized image of the Indigenous, you know, relationship with land, and then the commodity foods and the food stamps and the bannock and the sweetened condensed milk, because the reality is always a mix of that. But I think what's important, absolutely, I think it's way more important, but way more complex. But, you know, for example, I just wanted to share quickly that with Sean Sherman, who I mentioned in Minneapolis, with his restaurant, he describes the aim of the restaurant as, quote, feeding people without extracting from the earth. So related to your question, yeah, what does this look like? What does this mean? And, you know, what are the stakes of it in terms of imagining different relations, not just with who we eat food with, but the food that we're eating.
In a synergic, always. How do we are with time? I can have more 2 questions or only one? As you want. 2 more. Okay. Okay, well, since my own work is closely connected to art and representation, I was really struck by how your research showed that what a cuisine can tell doesn't depend only on the interaction of the chef, but also on broader frameworks. Ingredients, regulation, visual element, can even the restaurant space itself. On the one hand, laws around animals like beaver, seal, or salmon limit what indigenous restaurant can actually cook and show. On the other, menus, displayed objects, and cultural choices can shape or sometimes distort the story food tells. At the same time, we see more and more food art projects, food performances, spectacular buffet, food design show with cascade or ham walls. In this context, the exhibition Best Before, curated by Lisa Meyers, feels very different. It uses food and this material traces to talk about memory, absence, and cultural continuity without going through the regulated plate of the restaurant. How important do you think visual and artistic practices are in expanding what food can say or in pushing back against dominant narratives and regulation? And where do you see the risk that these practices turn into a trend, more about aesthetics and fashion than about the complex stories behind the food?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so one thing that became very obvious to me when I was doing the research is that restaurants are very visual. And so it's often not just through language in terms of the name of a restaurant or, you know, how the menu is narrated, but, you know, through decor. And so that's something that really, you know, kind of signals certain cultural fluency or allegiances and, you know, also challenges them. And so it's a really interesting question because with the Mukkamuk restaurant, the one that opened in Vancouver in 1971, it became a restaurant because, as I mentioned, the Ace Gallery that was involved with it, they actually just wanted to do an exhibition of what they called Pacific Northwest Native Foods. And because of regulations, they weren't able to do the exhibition, so instead they ended up creating this restaurant. But what is interesting about some of them is a lot of the restaurants then have collaborated with Indigenous artists, so, you know, commissioning them to have certain artworks, and also sometimes having artworks for sale for supporting communities. But it's hard because I think that trend is it's a sticky word. And I think specifically here about a chef called Rich Francis, and he's Haudenosaunee, and he was the first Indigenous chef to compete on Top Chef Canada. And he was asked in a lot of interviews about how Indigenous food was a trend. And he hates the word trend because trend by default is supposed to be something that it's short-lived. You know, it comes and then it goes. And he said that what he was trying to achieve as a chef instead was something that was long-lasting. And I think it's kind of similar in terms of anything that pops up as a trend or with the aesthetics of it, because with a lot of these restaurants, it's more than about how things look, it's really about storytelling. And it's a very holistic approach to storytelling, and that you find in the names, in the language, in the menu, in the ingredients, in the relations, in the decor, in the art, etc.
It's like created an interworld world.
Exactly, yeah.
All around one narration.
Yeah.
Okay, so toward the end, you return to the lexicon, again, of repair, recuperate, reconcile, and to the idea that restaurant evokes restoration, medicinal broth, putting bodies back on their feet. So my final question, do you believe restaurants and menus can be real tools for decolonizing foodways and land, or do they always risk remaining embedded in a market logic that also sells repair itself? And for us as students or normal people, how can we navigate restaurants and food discourses without falling into the polished rhetoric of the wall zone that conceal violence?
Yeah, so I mean, restaurants contain multiples, and I think that we're in an interesting period because eating out has really become a popular culture. And so we have a whole range, and on the one hand, and I think that, you know, really expensive cities, especially like a place like New York City, is suffering from this, where more and more it's corporations that are opening restaurants and just having investors. And so that's obviously kind of the capitalist mode of extraction. But on the other hand, you know, there are examples of restaurants that are very much related to community. And, you know, I have been asked at certain points about this research where, you know, the criticism that, okay, well, yeah, Indigenous restaurants, they're still selling food. They're still participating in the logic of capitalism. They're still commercial spaces. Absolutely, but I would argue that because they are also tools for reimagining that, for offering different relations. And this comes back to the work of Owamni, which, as I mentioned, I also wanted to pass this book around, which is called Chefs, Restaurants, and Culinary Sustainability. It was published last year, and I have a chapter towards the end which is about Indigenous restaurants in the United States. But I think that, you know, they do have the ability to tell different stories and thinking about different relationships with land, and also which producers are you supporting. And that was one of the reasons, unfortunately, Niche Dish closed in Toronto, because Joel was supporting mostly Indigenous producers. He was spending a lot of money on ingredients, and that needs to obviously work, but there are ways of supporting other modes of food production, I believe. And so restaurants can go in both ways, but I think the community level is really important.
Yeah, of course. Like, for example, I don't know if in Canada exists the cantina, cantina as a mensa. I don't know the translation in English. Canteen.
Not like here, or okay. Even in Germany, because in Germany the mensa, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know if
Thank you so much, and maybe we take some questions from the people, the audience. Domande? Luigi Conte, ci pensi?
Hi, thank you so much. Nice to see you here, and thank you for the conversation. I'm curious about a couple of things that are at the margins of your story. In part, you already addressed it in the conversation. One is nutrition. When you had the list of Canadian products, starting from milk, it looked to me more a list of nutrition sources than a menu in the consumerist sense of being in a restaurant and having the food to buy. So something about that. The second one would be about labor, which you addressed in various ways. So we have the product in the shop, in the restaurant, with the price. Behind that, there are cooking people, there are people harvesting, there are people transporting food. So that whole world, how does it fit in your reconstruction of food? So we have land, but what about this? Which also leads to issues like cooking. Who cooks? So there are indigenous restaurants and indigenous restaurants, which you address. So how do indigenous people cook and eat apart from the self-representation or the representation?
Do you want me to questions or?
As you wish. I'm happy to.
Yeah. Anyone else? Okay.
Okay, so I'm glad that you brought up that first point, because a lot of scholarship about Indigenous foodways, and this is across Turtle Island, so both Canada and the US, has mostly focused on what is called diet. So thinking about nutrition. And so that was one thing that I wanted to change a little bit in terms of my focus, because one thing that I noticed a little bit, and I published a piece last year in the journal called Food and History, and this was specifically about whale meat, which is called muktuk in Inuit cultures, which is quite popular. And in that article, I talk about the politics of delicacies. So often if somebody is describing a delicacy, there's an element of distance there. But I also address how it's quite inconsistent in terms of who has a diet versus who has a cuisine when it comes to scholarship. And so, for example, thinking about Inuit or, Northern Indigenous people, it was often the focus on their diets as opposed to cuisine. And cuisine makes room for cultural choices, but also the manipulation of ingredients. And so that doesn't always have to be with heat. We can think about that also in terms of the role that freezing plays. That's also a way of transforming cell structure and also taste. And so that was one thing that with the project, I write that in the introduction, where with my work, I don't focus so much on what the food does nutritionally or even approaches to nutrition. So not so much what it does for the body, but instead understanding it a little bit more in terms of the symbolism of it and kind of the discourses around it and how it materializes other cultural beliefs about what is fit to eat for whom. But I think it is a really, really important point because, like I said, and this kind of goes in the direction of this idea of repressive authenticity. So, you know, with some Indigenous chefs, if they want to include contemporary ingredients, or even Sean Sherman, who only uses pre-contact ingredients, but he uses various cooking techniques and, you know, is really inspired by, you know, contemporary approaches. And then people are like, well, that's not traditional. And so this idea that, you know, then some people have to kind of continue this idea of how people prepared food 500 years ago, but actually continuing to prepare that food creates new traditions around it or kind of keeps it going. The labor is really fascinating, and this is why I wanted to just give a preview of the mukamuk, because what happened with that particular example was actually the restaurant was able to receive a grant from the government of British Columbia to employ Indigenous people. And so that was then seen as, you know, kind of creating job opportunities. But that was the whole tension, right? Because the restaurant visually, optically was very Indigenous presenting because almost all the servers were Indigenous, but then they were also required to wear certain jewelry or, you know, have their hair in certain ways, and then they didn't have the last word over the menu. And so that was the whole issue in terms of who was doing the labor, but who was making the final decisions. So this is something that is a huge issue with restaurant culture in general, especially because the chef is often the star and everyone who is cooking in the kitchen doesn't have the same limelight. And then also thinking about the whole politics of food production, and this kind of comes back to what I was saying with different relations to land and producers, that quite often, including in Canada, a lot of people who are doing agricultural labor are on short-term temporary visas from places like Mexico, right? And so with some of the Indigenous restaurants, a lot of them try to have Indigenous staff and have different relationships to their producers and support Indigenous producers. But it is an issue with restaurants in general.
With food in general, maybe.
Yeah.
I was very struck. Thank you, wonderful presentation and wonderful book. I was very struck, I don't know if we can go back to it, I know it's not exactly what the book is about, but I was very struck by that image in which you showed us the two Indigenous women looking at I mean, was that part of a campaign, or was it something that happened in schools or community centers, or and has that kind of thing been studied as such? I mean, what impact did that have on people's lives and diets, and is that something you're interested in looking at?
Yeah, no, it's so incredibly important. There's one historian at Toronto Metropolitan University, Ian Mosby, and he's written quite a bit about, I mean, it's such a gnarly, terrible history, but residential schools.
And it echoes so much with what is going on in the United States right now.
Yeah. So Ian Mosby has really studied some of what was happening at residential schools, and through incredible archival research, some of them were also performing nutritional experiments on the children. So thinking about, you know, certain milks that were then enhanced with like extra minerals or vitamins or that kind of thing, and essentially using these children as, for lack of a better word, guinea pigs, right? So kind of testing, you know, a more industrial approach to certain ingredients. And so this is what happened with this, is that, you know, with the Indian residential schools, because kids were essentially kidnapped from their families, sent to these boarding schools where the purpose was to, quote unquote, kill the Indian to save the child. children were separated from their siblings. A lot of them didn't speak English or French when they went to these schools, and then all of a sudden their food was wildly different. What's really terrible with residential schools is so they were serving foods that, you know, really kind of followed this idea of, you know, having grain, having so the cereal, having milk, but they underfed the kids. And so there were a lot of examples, quite frankly, of starvation, you know, having a shortage of this. But this was the whole thing because, you know, obviously, so Canada has over 600 Indigenous nations. In the US, they're called tribes. In Canada, they're called bands. But everyone had, you know, food systems, right? They had systems of producing food and of preparing food and of distributing food. But because people were moved off of their lands, and then, you know, surprise, surprise, like a lot of the excellent lands they were kicked off of, and all of a sudden they lost the ability to feed themselves, and then they became dependent exactly on these commodity foods. So that's a huge part of the work of a lot of contemporary Indigenous chefs, and this comes back to Joel White Duck Ringette, who I mentioned in NICHE-Dash, where a lot of this is then reclaiming health. And so Fulvia mentioned this exhibition that Lisa Myers, who's Anishinaabe, and she's a member of the Beausoleil First Nation, that she curated called Best Before. And it includes a work by Casey Adams, who is Cree, based in Winnipeg. And she created an installation where it was ceramic pots, but she didn't fire them. And so for the duration of the exhibition, they started to erode because of the ingredients that were in them. And so these were examples of the so-called like 5 gifts of the white man. So there was milk in these pots. There was also wheat flour. There was also refined sugar. And so she was using it as a metaphor for thinking with the body. And so this has had huge consequences because amongst Indigenous communities across Turtle Island, rates of diabetes are super, super high. And so that's then also connected to, you know, health and quality of life. And so a lot of the chefs, you know, they're very in tune with that in terms of reclaiming their knowledge and the relations to health and to cuisine.
Sasha, thank you very much for your presentation. I am super impressed and I'm really inspired. And I have probably 2 questions as well. And the first, who is coming to dinner? So actually, who is, maybe you could, as an environmental historian, see the trends and the change as clients of Indigenous restaurants in Canada. And the second question is about future. So how you see the possible trajectories in the development of Indigenous restaurants, of course, generally speaking. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for that fun question, because there's that film of Guess Who's Coming for Dinner. And, you know, I really love the project by Adrienne Stimson and A.A. Bronson because it's just a reminder of, you know, these histories, they're uncomfortable. And making them comfortable is not a way of making them go away, but kind of sitting with that discomfort and going through it. And with the first Toronto Biennial in 2019, the curator is Candace Hopkins, and I forget the name of the nation that she's part of. It's in northern Canada, and she now runs Forge, which is in upstate New York. And this kind of connects to the second question, where it's a center that is all about Indigenous futures. So it's residency programs for Indigenous artists, and then having a lot of programming around that related to food, related to land, and rebuilding those relations. And so I think that is one of those, you know, I mean, the interesting thing is I talk a little bit in the book who the people are going to these restaurants and how the reviews have changed over time. And, you know, there's elements of kind of novelty, somebody wanting to try a cuisine they haven't tried before, but then also, you know, curiosity or learning more about culture, or, you know, just having a space for conversations, right? And I think that that's what these restaurants are providing. But just one more thing about the future. The thing is, it's still really hard. I mean, restaurants are notoriously difficult to keep running. I sometimes...
Because you speak about difficulty in... Because you speak also about difficulty in bureaucracy and funding, and also maybe, I don't know if there is a difference between indigenous restaurant and Canadian restaurant in this.
Well, I mean, just, you know, it's always a lot of red tape, right? Getting the permits for everything, having the right paperwork to be able to serve certain foods. And one of the things that is changing right now in Canada, because Canada is deeply against the idea of becoming the 51st state, is that there are also regulations between provinces regarding trade. So there's examples of chefs who are working in border regions within Canada, so kind of the border between the provinces of Quebec and Ontario, and they can have one ingredient in one province but not in the other province. And so there's also borders regarding that. And, you know, also then what does that mean in terms of what is conceptualized as like a local ingredient, especially for a lot of places where getting something from the US might be closer than getting it from another part of Canada and then coming back to these borders.
Related to the question about customers, which are their relationship with tourism? You spoke about Noma in Copenhagen. That is absolutely a tourism attraction, actually, for the city. So indigenous restaurants are coming, I don't know, or transforming the tourism attraction, or it's based on destination types. And another curiosity, because you stay here, you told me that you stay here in Venice. Do you think there is an example, if there is one, of indigenous restaurant here in Venice? Thanks.
A tough second question, thank you. So I'll go to the first part and work my way to the second one. I mean, tourism is a huge part of it. And so that's why, you know, I started with La Tundra. And I don't think it's like an accident that happened in 1967, right? And then kind of that's around the time of the Multiculturalism Act, or, you know, just a very different relationship to cultural heritage in both Canada and the United States. And so tourism has been something that has been really important, both in terms of events that attract tourists, and like expos. There was also one in Vancouver in 1986, and there was kind of a similar pop-up there. I write about a restaurant called Chief Chiniki, which is close to Banff, just outside of Calgary, and so that was also very much connected to tourists. But, you know, that is also the question that comes up with some of these restaurants too, in price category, and, you know, them being accessible to communities or tourists, and just trying to find that balance. I mean, there's so much to say about Noma that is not related to your question, but I do just want to say that they're about to do the pop-up in Los Angeles. I don't know if anyone's looked at it. A ticket per person is $1,500 US. Yeah, so I'm curious because they've done a couple before. They've been in Kyoto, they were in Tulum. Tulum brought up a lot of these questions too, because of local indigenous peoples, and, you know, this question of kind of cultural ownership of, you know, foodways. Rene Redzepi has done stuff earlier in Australia where he got a lot of like slack, understandably, for. but it will be interesting to see what happens in LA with a pop-up for that. But, that's like a whole other level. And then part of it is that, Noma announced that it was closing its permanent restaurant in Copenhagen to do kind of this more pop-up structure. And this comes back to the question of labor. And that was because for years, Noma was not paying people who worked there, right? Because they were doing these prestigious stages so they could put Noma on their CV. I mean, indigeneity, it's a sticky concept. It's a relational concept. And, that's something, especially thinking about Turtle Island, until colonization, nobody was indigenous. It wasn't a concept there. It required the trauma and violence of colonization to have this. And, that's why it's also, for me, so important to recognize the plurality and coming back to the over 600 nations, because it's then really thinking about, what is a European restaurant? And then, comparing that to indigenous restaurant. So it's really hard to say with Venice, but I think, as Fulvia already mentioned, I think, this idea of cultural heritage of Italian cuisine, there's a lot there about who's allowed to partake, and there's a lot of racism that is hidden under terms like authenticity.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe if we try to find out an indigenous restaurant, we risk to following the authenticity. And so why we have to say that one restaurant it's indigenous and not another one because it's run by I don't know who, but someone that it's not from Venice. Yeah, I think it's pretty.
Yeah, and about this, I've been thinking about, so I study cod now, and I 100% blame Venice for this, and how I'm now devoting my life to cod, at least for a couple more years. And so I was in Portugal doing research for the month of September, and it was really interesting to see, because there was a lot of parallels too in terms of tourism getting completely out of hand and Airbnbs. And it was so interesting to me because I was in Porto for my first 2 weeks, and every restaurant I kept going to, like, I heard no one speaking Portuguese. And then I said to my friend Raya, I was like, I went to a sushi restaurant last night, and it was the most Portuguese I've heard in a restaurant in the past 2 weeks. And I found that really interesting too, in terms of, beyond the menu alone, but just which restaurants attract locals and communities, right? And so, there's a lot happening there, where I think some of the restaurants my friends here like to go to are not the ones that would attract tourists who are here for X number of days and want to eat Venetian food.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.